important to like look at the different ways that different people have interpreted the Chinese result and find out which one of those interpretations is going to work for you the best. Which, by the way, doesn't mean tell you what you want to hear. So, and that's an important distinction. And if people, and this is one of the big things with divination, if people cannot differentiate between what they want to hear and what they're being told, then it's just going to be a way to delude themselves even further. The nice thing about the I-ching is there's a system of hexagrams, each with 6 lines, and periodically, as it comes up, there will be changing lines. So one hexagram evolves into another. And when we're looking at the interconnectedness of things, that's a very useful tool to have, because you can see, and if you really study the I-ching, it's important to look at which lines change, because each line has its own meaning and its own interpretation in the Chinese. And so if you look at what changes to produce what result, then it forms this like ideological matrix of ideas, which people can get more into if they look at particularly Crowley's Liber Trigrammaton. He does analysis of the trigrams which make up the hexagrams and uses that in a way to explain becoming, I would say, in that concept, or like coming into manifestation. There's different people use different methods. Like I said, I just use 3 coins, which is, some people are really traditional and they go through the arrow sticks and they want to have that exactly right. I've never thought that was necessary, and I've certainly gotten reliable results just using 3 coins. And I never really found that it needed a lot of ritual or preparation of that nature beforehand to really get a good result. You know, certainly it's important to be focused, it's important to be in the right state of mind when you're actually manipulating these objects, but you know, I think that you can over-ritualize this stuff. It has more to do with being able to see how your result relates to the question. And once again, just to keep a record of everything. And I'm probably going to repeat myself on that many, many times, but that's the most important thing.
Apparently the probabilities are slightly different using the arrow sticks from using coins, but nevertheless, maybe the I-ching itself, you know, realizes that you're using the arrow sticks instead of coins, so
yeah. I don't know. It would be interesting, I think, to compare the two. I haven't ever used the arrow stick method. I'm not really familiar with it, so like. But that's maybe a mistake on my part, because that's where I haven't tried both and compared them, which, you know, I always do say that people should do. But actually, and the transliteration that I go with the most was this like hippie guy from the 70s. That's not really like, it's not considered to be one of the standard versions of it at all. But I've found it very useful. Crowley has his own version of it too.
What's that translation?
You know what? I would have to send that to you. I can't remember the guy's name off the top of my head. It was just one that my mother had growing up from her college days that I grabbed and still in the library there. Now, the second method that I would look at is astrology. And obviously, like, there's a lot written about astrology. There's probably more garbage written about astrology than anything in history. And Crowley kind of points out the really big difficulty with astrology is that there's so many factors to consider. If you're looking at the idea that objects in space have an effect on events on Earth, then you should be looking at everything in the solar system, which means like asteroids, planetoids, small moons, what's everything doing? And Crowley's just like, this is just too much information to really take in at the same time and really harmonize. And I think that you can develop an intuition for astrology. If people want to work with that, then what they should really be doing is like literally just do natal charts for everyone you know. Look at the planets, look at the people you know, and look at commonalities. And if you see that different people have the same aspect, and you notice that common traits and characteristics in those people, then you will be able to more reliably predict what happens when you see that aspect come up. And it really is only through experience and getting to know the people who you're doing the charts for that you get to get a real good sense of this. And that's why a lot of books on astrology have lots of charts for like famous people and celebrities and whatnot. Like, and you can look at what common factors they have. I mean, for example, one that my father actually glued me onto very early was that if you see someone with a Neptune on their descendant, they're almost always a smoker, and when they smoke, they don't dream. And you know, that's a completely common factor that I've found in people who I've done charts for myself. That's just one example, but it's small things like that that you pick up on, and when you the more that you do it, the more that you pick up on those things, then the more you get to understand the system. And I would also say that like a lot of people they read in a book and they want to say that, okay, if a certain planet and aspect is here, then this is what's going to happen. Oh, Jupiter is transiting this portion of my chart, so this is the result I'm going to have because it says so in the book. And I said, I don't do that. Like, write down what position the planets are in your record and make note of what's happening at the time and find the correspondences that way. I mean, that's a far more reasonable way, I think, to learn how to really do astrology than reading a book and like coming up with this aspect is this and this aspect is that. It's also, I also think that you should take as much into account as possible when doing this, but like, for example, events have births in a way, and you can do a natal chart for an event, or you can do a natal chart for a building, or a company, or a city. Like, the time that that thing is born affects that the same way that it affects a person. And I do think that there's a lot of legitimacy to, and there are certain very talented astrologers out there. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that everyone's a crank. And there's many different ways of looking at astrology, but simply I find the fact that it's culturally universal. It's very rare to find people who aren't interested in what the stars and planets are doing. It's one of the things that affects us as humans when we look up and see that, and there's an interpretation or a version of that almost universally. Also, it's important to do, if we are ceremonial magicians and we're doing ceremonial magic, it is important to look at where the stars and the planets are. It's keyed into the Enochian system, which makes it keyed into virtually everything that comes afterward. John Dee, who did this stuff, was Queen Elizabeth's personal astrologer. That was kind of his thing. And he was also a renowned mathematician in geometry and navigation and all those other things. And he took this stuff very seriously, and he was constantly looking at what the stars and planets were doing. All angelic magic is essentially keyed into astrology. And I would say that if you are trying to contact an angel who's associated with a particular planet, it would be very, very silly to do it while that planet was below the horizon, or not bright, or in a weak aspect at that time. That's just standard. I mean, we do hexagram rituals to invoke particular planets and their particular energies, and if that's happening, then someone should really be aware of what the planet's doing, where it is in the sky, and what other planets it's associated with or connected to, or what aspects it's connected to. And good astrology programs are actually not hard to come by at all. They're not expensive, and it's very easy for us. I mean, a guy like Dee would have had to spend hours with charts and telescopes and various devices that have to do with math that I don't understand. And
now you can get an app for your phone.
Yeah.
Point it in the sky and find a star you're looking for. Right?
Yeah, exactly. It's very easy for us. We have that information at our fingertips, which I think he brings us a little bit closer to accomplishing what Crowley thought was going to be so difficult about harmonizing that information and getting all that information together in the same place. Like, the technology is there for us today in a way that it hasn't been ever at any point in history. So that's a big opportunity right there. The other one that I'll talk about, and there's only one of these systems that I'm really going to go in depth with, and that's going to be the tarot. And I'm not going to have a huge, so I very rarely list stuff off from a book, but I think it is useful to look at, because Crowley gives each of the cards in the Minor Arcana its own title, and I think that if we just look at the titles, then we see something interesting about the sequence. And I think that I think it's very useful for people to learn these cards by these titles instead of their numbers and their suits necessarily, because it's more of an elaboration. When we look at the wand suit, which is the beginning of things coming to manifestation associated with the element of fire, and the first tip of the yod in the Yod He Val He formula, we see dominion, which becomes virtue, which turns into completion, which falls into strife, which turns into victory, which becomes valor, which goes into swiftness, and becomes strength, and realizes itself in oppression. So we see, and Crowley explains that what happens is we come up with a pure idea.